Welcome to Mercy Medical Center's live webinar. Today we'll be discussing the health implications of domestic violence. Joining us is Elizabeth Hoffman, ARNP at the Mercy Employee Health Center. After her discussion, she will take questions from our audience. To submit your questions anytime during the discussion, go to the window in the upper right-hand corner of your screen and type in your question. If you don't see the screen, click on the orange box with the white arrow. Your questions will be confidential. Well, welcome to the webinar, Betty. I'm going to turn the mic over to you now so we can go ahead and get started.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. When one first starts thinking about domestic violence, it could be considered maybe just a social problem or perhaps a legal one. However, with a better understanding, domestic violence will be recognized as also being a very important health-related problem. What exactly is domestic violence? It is also termed intimate partner violence and spouse or partner violence. I will be using these terms kind of interchangeably, but it includes any intimate partner relationship. It is intentional, physical, or psychological harm to a current or former intimate partner. It can, to name some examples, include intimidation, assault, battery, forced sexual activity, threats, emotional abuse, such as name-calling or belittlement, withholding money, isolation from family and friends. The abuse may include several of these forms at the same time. It can be constant, intermittent, or cyclic. The abuser may express regret and promise it will never happen again, but it will recur. The purpose of domestic violence is to power and control the partner. Accurate data regarding this problem is very difficult to obtain and quantify because it is grossly underreported and because of the varying terms that have been used to describe it over the years. Many victims don't want to report the violence because they may fear, love, depend on, or wish to protect the abuser. Even today, there are many societies in the world where women are treated as the property of her husband, and he is seen as having the right to use whatever force is necessary relating to her. There are even segments in our American society where this attitude still exists. The National Violence Against Women Survey, funded by the CDC and the National Institute of Justice in 2000, found evidence to estimate that 5.3 million intimate partner victimizations occur among U.S. women ages 18 and older each year, and results in nearly 2 million injuries, with more than 550,000 requiring medical attention. We know that it extends to all socioeconomic, ethnic, religious, racial, and age groups. There are no geographic or educational boundaries for domestic violence. The victims are disproportionately women, but domestic violence can certainly occur to men, especially in gay relationships. However, the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey conducted by the CDC in 2010 found victims to be around 70% female. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence listed 7,047 reported cases in 2005, which was an 8% increase from 2004, and of those, 81% were female. So today, I'm going to be focusing mostly about female victims. Unfortunately, domestic violence has been present since the beginning of recorded history, but many factors kept it from being recognized. Some of those included a lack of understanding that the behavior is often a learned behavior, meaning children learned it from their parents, relatives, or friends, and thus families didn't consider it abnormal and so didn't report it. The learned behavior can be true for both the abuser and the victim. There has also been a lack of public awareness regarding the severity and far-reaching consequences of the problem, with many still believing it is a private matter within the family and best left alone. The more recent continual exposure to violent behavior in entertainment, sports, and media may also be contributing to it not being recognized as much as it should be. Domestic violence began to be given increased public awareness by the women's movement in the 1970s. The first shelter for the abused was established in 1974. Many shelters now provide support to abuse survivors and their children. Domestic violence doesn't just affect the abused and the abuser. It also affects witnesses to the abuse, other family members, co-workers, friends, and the entire community. For example, victims may take more absences from work to visit a doctor for injuries, or may avoid others until bruises and injuries are not as noticeable. The dynamics of domestic violence are very difficult to understand. The violence is used to establish and maintain control over another. It may start very subtly, but then always escalates, either in severity, duration, or to include multiple kinds of abuse. The constant exposure and living in fear profoundly affects the victim. They will sometimes blame their own behavior rather than the abuser. They may think they should be better at cooking, cleaning, or whatever, and then the abuser would not be so violent. This, and having to admit that they are being abused, leads to fear, shame, and isolation, all of which interfere with the victim seeking help. Abusers continue the abuse or threat of abuse to maintain this control. Victims stay in the situation for a variety of reasons. The attitude for many years was that the abuse couldn't be that bad or she would just leave. In fact, the U.S. Department of Justice National Crime Survey in 1995 reported that the most dangerous and sometimes lethal time for a victim who is being abused is when she tries to leave. Some of the reasons victims choose not to leave may include fear of the abuser because of what he has threatened would happen to the victim or her children, feeling that she still loves the partner and wants things to work out, an inability to form a plan to leave because of low self-esteem, confidence, and possibly substance abuse, which is used to help tolerate the behavior. Religious beliefs may interfere with leaving also. Fear of the unknown, being on their own, possibly with children to support, can be a factor. Some receive, or perceive at least, pressure from friends and family to stay. If there are children in the household, they can also be greatly affected. Domestic violence statistics point to increased abuse occurring during pregnancy. Research reveals that in households where women are abused, a substantial portion of their children are also victims of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. Even if they are not being abused themselves, children may either see or hear the abusive behavior directed towards the victim. These children may suffer severe emotional and developmental difficulties, similar to those suffered by children who are the direct victims of child abuse, neglect, or sexual abuse. They can display mental health issues, problems with school, or have problems forming healthy relationships outside the home. Children who witness violence may learn the behavior of either the victim or the abuser and become the next generation capable of continuing the problem. How domestic violence affects health is broad and encompasses many aspects. Violence has been linked to a host of different outcomes, both immediate and long-term. Again, accurate statistics on the extent of injuries caused by partner abuse are difficult to calculate due to underreporting, but it is known that physical battery accounts for more injuries to women between the ages of 18 and 44 than muggings, rapes, and car accidents combined. It is the leading cause of non-fatal injuries to women in the U.S. Physical injuries may be minor to severe, ranging from cuts, scrapes, or welts to choking, broken bones, or dislocated joints, chipped or broken teeth, internal bleeding, and head or spinal cord injuries. Some injuries can lead to permanent disabilities. Sexual violence used to hurt, degrade, dominate, or humiliate can potentially also cause physical trauma and emotional harm. Women who are abused suffer an increased risk of unplanned or early pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases. Women are particularly vulnerable to attacks when pregnant and thus may more often experience medical difficulties in their pregnancy or have adverse outcomes such as low birth weight, miscarriage, and fetal death. Domestic violence may lead to increased risky behaviors such as increased smoking, drinking, and intoxication, other drug use, unprotected and perhaps unwanted sexual encounters, all of which will increase potential harm to one's health. Physical health in general can be jeopardized. The violence and abuse can result in many health problems, such as chronic headaches, back and muscle pain, gastrointestinal problems, and limited mobility resulting from previous injury to joints and bones, or just feelings of poor overall health status. Conditions may continue as lifelong even when or if the victim is able to leave or get away from the abuse. They can cause difficulty in being able to trust and sustain any future relationship. Emotional or psychological harm can result, for example, from name-calling, threats to harm the victim or her children, threatening with a weapon, withholding money for daily needs, or forced isolation away from other family and friends. This harm is often not as visible, but the scars are traumatic and long-lasting. The emotional and psychological emotional and psychological impact likely has longer term than the physical and may be much more costly to treat than physical injuries. It can cause depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, shame and withdrawal, as well as flashbacks, panic attacks, insomnia, eating disorders, and suicide attempts. At the extreme end, domestic violence can be fatal. Women are both intentionally murdered by their partners and can lose their life as a result of injuries. Research also indicates that women who are abused may be more likely to commit suicide. UNICEF reported in Domestic Violence Against Women and Girls, published in 2000, that worldwide studies indicate suicide is 12 times more likely to have been attempted by a woman who has been abused than by one who has not. Maternal death can result from unsafe abortions as well. Women are most at risk of being killed either in the process of attempting to leave or soon after leaving. In general, the following are conclusions about the health consequences of abuse. The influence of abuse can persist long after the abuse itself has stopped. The more severe the abuse, the greater its impact on a woman's physical and mental health. The impact over time of different types of abuse and of multiple episodes of abuse appears to be cumulative. If you are suspicious that you are in an abusive relationship, answering these questions may help. Are you ever afraid of your partner? Has your partner ever physically hurt or threatened to hurt you or someone you care about? Does your partner ever force you to engage in sexual activities that make you uncomfortable? Do you constantly worry about your partner's moods and change your behavior to deal with them? Does your partner try to control where you go, what you do, and who you see? Does your partner constantly accuse you of having affairs? Have you stopped seeing family or friends to avoid your partner's jealousy or anger? Does your partner control your finances? Does he threaten to kill himself if you leave? Does your partner claim his temper is out of control due to alcohol, drugs, or because he had an abusive childhood? If you answer yes to some or all of these questions, you could be suffering from intimate partner abuse. If you have become a victim, the only way to break the cycle is to take action. First and foremost, remember that no one deserves abuse. It is not your fault, and you deserve to live free of fear. You are not the cause of your partner's abusive behavior. You deserve to be treated with respect. You deserve a safe and happy life, just as your children do. You are not alone, and there are people waiting to help you. Breaking free from abuse or leaving an abuser can potentially be dangerous, however, so help is needed and available. Contact a local shelter, support group, or Victims Assistance Center for guidance and support. They should be able to help or should be able to refer you to other services, including legal help, counseling for you and your children, employment programs, educational opportunities, and financial assistance. Locally, Waypoint provides guidance and support as well as shelter. Their number is 319-363-2093. If you are not local and you need to find the closest support to you, a resource may be the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 800-799-SAFE or 7233, or the Iowa Coalition Against Domestic Violence at 800-942-0333. Supporting people at these numbers can help you create a safety plan and give you guidance if you decide to transition to leaving, or give you information about a local resource. Contact your local health care provider who may be able to guide you to resources and help you with physical and emotional problems so you're better able to cope and function. Admit the abuse to someone you can trust, a friend, loved one, neighbor, or coworker. Reaching out to one person may be the start to becoming safe. Information can be obtained by contacting police or legal counsel to consider your legal options. Restraining orders are helpful for some. This year, Iowa became one of 12 states to notify domestic violence victims when protective orders have been issued to keep an abuser away from the victim. Domestic abuse victims sign up with the state and receive an automated phone call or email notification when courts issue a protective order. Last year, more than 15,000 protective and no-contact orders were processed. I mention this only in hopes that it will be encouraging that society is attempting to address the problem that it has so long misunderstood and been undetected. If someone close to you is in an abusive relationship, be supportive. But it is important to remember that most victims want the violence to end, but not the relationship. It is easy to say, just leave, but hopefully now you understand that it is not that easy. Ending an important relationship is never easy. It's even harder if you've been isolated, psychologically beaten down, financially controlled, and physically threatened. But do become involved and advise victims of ways you can help, such as providing housing, childcare, transportation, and so on. If you hear a violent incident occurring, call the police. Demonstrate concern. Tell the victim the abuse is not their fault. Let them know you are afraid for their welfare and possibly the welfare of their children. Hearing that others see the violence on the children will often prompt victims to seek assistance. Supportive, positive messages may enable victims to find strength to escape. But it is also very important to understand if they are reluctant to escape, staying might be a very right survival strategy for them. Let them know you are willing to help when they are ready to ask for assistance. Do not confront the abuser, as that could potentially make the abuse worse for the victim. You, or for that matter, the victim, cannot make the abuse stop. Only the abuser can do that. Don't end your support once the victim has left. They are still in danger, and this is a very difficult time for them. Again, numbers to contact for help: Waypoint 319-363-2093. The National Domestic Violence Hotline 800-799-SAFE or 7233. The Iowa Coalition Against Domestic Violence 800-942-0333. You may also contact me, and my email address is ehoffman@mercycare.org, or you can call the Mercy Employee Health Center at 319-398-6342 for further information or for resources. The prevention of spouse-partner abuse is dependent upon national, community, and individual efforts. It must begin with a national awareness of the problem and education to understand how such violence affects women and children in our society. So I thank you for joining me today, and I would be glad to entertain any questions you may have.
Well, thank you, Betty. Very good information. And to remind our listeners, your questions can be submitted from the box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And again, if you don't see the box, look at the little box with the white arrow. It's a little orange box. Click on that, and it should open up so that you can type in your questions. Okay, we'll go to our first question here. Betty, can you give me examples of a safety plan?
A safety plan is established. We try to direct people to establish safety plans kind of individually, but some of the basic things are to learn to recognize the abuser's red flags, which will always trigger increased violence, and be ready to leave at a moment's notice if necessary. Think about all possible escape routes from where you are and safer areas of the house, and try to avoid arguments with the abuser in areas with potential weapons or perhaps no exits. Another important safety point is to choose ahead of time a safe place to go, perhaps a friend or a relative, motel, something, so that you have a destination in mind. And then pack a survival kit, which could include money for cabs or telephone, a change of clothes, perhaps an extra car or house key, medications, or at least prescriptions, or copies of a prescription perhaps insurance information, credit cards if possible, important papers, and try to find a safe place either in the home to store these that would be readily accessible and obtainable, or perhaps leave it with a trusted neighbor or friend. And then some of the other things that can be suggested would be possibly starting to start an individual savings account and have the statement sent to someone else. Memorizing phone numbers. We all rely on our cell phones for numbers, but if perhaps our cell phone is taken away or we have to leave without it and we don't have any numbers, so memorize numbers for the shelter perhaps, or just important numbers that would be helpful.
Several questions coming in here, so we're going to just take one at a time. Another one is related to mandatory reporters. are healthcare providers mandatory reporters, and then does that include domestic violence victims, and then will they call the cops?
You're exactly right. The healthcare providers are mandatory reporters for child and elder abuse. They are not mandatory reporters for domestic violence victims. We let the victim decide if the time is right. Now, we may offer for them to see a social worker or have the police come to meet them somewhere safe. So that the victim could at least explore other options. But no, a short answer to your question is that we are not mandatory reporters for domestic violence.
We have a lengthy question that's come in, and I'm going to try to just summarize that it's a situation where there was not any physical abuse, just emotional and verbal abuse. It's been an ongoing situation. It sounds like received an order to evict him. Custody. So it's just been an ongoing problem, but I think the gist of the matter is there's a situation of emotional, verbal abuse, and wondering is there anything else a victim can do if there's not the physical abuse, the evidence there. Betty, can you answer that question?
Yes, there are things that can be done. Certainly, again, contacting the waypoint if this is something local, and they'll be very helpful in helping to either direct the victim as to what can be done, certainly talking to police and finding out if a restraining order would be available, which it sounds like maybe that was done. Sometimes you have to take it to the extreme and actually be the one that leaves, at least for a while. If you need to get the person needs to get away from the abuse. So if that can't be done by the abuser leaving, then sometimes the alternative is that the victim has to leave. So parting, putting space in between is the most safest if it's possible. So I guess without knowing specifics, it's very difficult to give advice, but in general, that's what I would recommend.
And again, Betty has her email address listed up here, her telephone number, if there's additional questions that you might want to follow up on that. Next question, can you explain the reason for increased violence during pregnancy?
First, remember that the highest instances of domestic violence is between the ages of 15 and 44, which is also the age range for pregnancy. But one report said that 1 in 6 women report her partner first abused her during pregnancy. So if you think about pregnancy, it certainly is a greater stress time for usually the entire family, but especially the victim. So any kind of stress can certainly be a trigger for increased abuse. However, probably one of the bigger factors is that the abuser probably feels some loss of control, especially if the woman is seeking regular prenatal care and their bodies are being more closely observed and monitored, as well as their mental health. So it may just increase because they are trying to maintain control.
Another question, does this apply to spiritual abuse? For example, if someone is in a cult group? Good question.
I would say that that again would depend on whether there is intimacy. So some cults are sexually intimate, and some are not. But in certain circumstances, yes, I would say that it could also be spiritual abuse.
I understand, another question here, I understand constant abuse, but what do you mean when you say abuse can be intermittent or cyclical? What causes the differences?
Intermittent may mean, or it means that it may only occur when the partner drinks alcohol or is very stressed, and it may occur just sporadically. It sometimes is so severe that people live in fear in between times, even if it isn't as often. But but even intermittent will many times become more and more frequent. Cyclic refers to a cycle that has been recognized for quite some time. It means that tension gradually builds within the relationship. Then there's an explosion occurring with physical, emotional, and or sexual abuse. After this explosion is called the honeymoon phase, when the abuser apologizes, tries to make up for the abuse, and tries to shift the blame to either the abused or to someone else. And then gradually the cycle starts over again. Now this may be something that is going on for, each part of the cycle can take varying lengths of time, depending on the relationship and the individual. The second part of that question was, why is one?
Oh, why is
why the difference? It could have something to do with just makeup of the person, or it could be something that has been learned.
We have a question that kind of combines the child abuse and domestic abuse. If spanking causes bruises on a child, is that considered domestic abuse on the children? If you report it to someone, how can you stay with your husband and protect your children without getting them removed from the home?
Spanking which causes bruising on a child would be considered child abuse. Unless they're intimate with that child, it would not be intimate partner abuse. If you report it to someone, how can you stay with your husband and protect the children without getting them taken away is a little tougher. You should report it because it is abuse to that child and should not occur. You can certainly choose to stay, especially if the partner is getting help, or accepts that he needs help. However, if he is not, then you have to decide, is the child most important and his health? So,
very tough situation to be in. Well, question, is there ever a way to tell before you get into this relationship if it's likely your partner will be abusive? For example, are there any red flags to look for when people first start dating?
I would have to say I doubt it. In some instances, when you look, if the person looks back, they can probably say, I should have seen that. But many times abusers are very much the opposite in the beginning of the relationship. So you don't see perhaps the true side of them, mostly because, well, there could be various reasons. But many abused women report in the early part of the relationship, the partner was very attentive, kind, seemed to be perfect. If you, I can think of one instance that comes to mind. If you have observed or heard of them being abusive in a former relationship, I would say that's a very big red flag. Be very cautious. He can try to explain it as being provoked, but remember, violence in a relationship is never right, and no one deserves to be abused, no matter the reason. So control of things, those would be red flags. You know, always having to control where you go, what you do, who you see, choosing only certain friends and restricting others, maybe a red flag. So all those kinds of things that we talked about.
The next question is a little related to that. Asking about a 16-year-old daughter who may be emotionally abused by her boyfriend. Can you give this parent advice on how to talk with the teenager?
It's always interesting to try to talk to a teenager, of course, but again, the same kind of guidelines as what we talked about. If you know anyone that's in an abusive relationship, reinforce that that daughter is a very important person and is very much deserving of a good relationship, and that nobody deserves to be hit, slapped, ridiculed, forced to do things that make her uncomfortable, or threatened in any way. So just be as supportive and help guide her to feeling positive about herself. Try not to let her become isolated from other friends that she perhaps had been in touch with. Teenage hormonal changes and establishing relationships are very complicated and a learning experience. So, it's sometimes that way for both the child and the parent. So, exploring other resources in your community, perhaps at school, could also give some guidance to building healthy relationships. I've heard of community programs called Safe Dates, or there's some schools that have MVP, Mentors in Violence Prevention. So explore the school. If they have contacts within or if you have contacts within the community or church, those can sometimes help tremendously, because teenagers tend to certainly sometimes respond better to peers than to parents.
Betty, what happens if I call Waypoint? What will they say? What will they ask me? Can you give us any idea of how that process might work?
Of course, it will depend on your questions or situation. I think mainly I'll just say that they have been well trained and will respond to any question with helpful advice and suggestions that can be trusted. I actually have never talked to them in that regard, but I have handed the phone to many victims and said, this person would be glad to talk to you. And I've never had anybody come away from that phone call with anything but a positive response, that they were glad they did it. So I can only say I don't want to get into specifics because I can't do that adequately, but I will say that they will help you to sort out many things.
We have a question that I can answer. The question is this PowerPoint available online after the webinar? And that answer is yes. It will be available at this same site, www.mercycare.org/live, and give us a couple days. If it's not up, sometimes there's a bit of a delay there, but do check back. And you can always check this website for information about future webinars, as well as listen to any of the webinars that have been given in the past months. Our next webinar topic is what first-time parents need to know with Dr. Roger Allen, a neonatologist at Mercy Birthplace. This webinar will be Thursday, August 9th from noon to 1, and then Dr. Allen will take questions live after his discussion also. Well, Betty, I believe we have answered all the questions that were submitted to us, but if you have additional concerns or questions, just to remind you again that Betty can be reached at 319-398-6342. Well, thank you all for joining us today.